Thank you so much for being here. That was a really nice intro. I'm wearing all black today because I'm interviewing Hillary Clinton later, and so I want to feel very Secret Service-y. I hope it works. With a little style, not much. Anyway, so we're going to be talking a lot about, it's so nice to see all these women here. I mean, when I cover Silicon Valley, and pretty much my life is one big sausage fest, so this is so fantastic. I also have 2 sons, so you can imagine how much that plays into my life, too. Anyway, we are going to start off today with a great panel of women, ladies, and talk about lady things, including leadership, running the world, and how we're going to take over in 2016. Okay. See, I know my crowd. Okay. Come on out, panel, and then I will introduce everyone out. Come on out, Jessica. This is Jessica from Stella Dot. Roz from Intel. And a very old friend of mine, hey, Jill Abramson. Jill, you're not wearing your pushy necklace. I thought you might.
I left it home.
Jill has a wonderful necklace that says pushy on it. After she was called a pushy broad. Are you a pushy broad?
Proudly so.
So we're going to talk about a wide range of stuff today, but why don't you guys each introduce yourself and what you do. Jessica, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Hi. Good morning. Thank you for having us. I'm Jessica Herrin, the CEO and founder of Stella Dot, which is really more than an accessories and now skincare company. It's really a platform for female entrepreneurship, and that's what I do.
So I'm Rosalind Hudnell, and I'm known as the Pushy Broad, who's the Vice President of HR and Chief Diversity Officer at Intel. And I get the pleasure of working amongst an incredible team that's really trying to drive not only change inside of Intel, but to help drive the industry to finally close our diversity gaps in 5 years.
And you just announced a large amount of money.
We did.
$300 million, is that correct?
Yes, and people focus a lot on the money, but what we're really focused on is getting to full representation of the talent that's available. So excited.
But the money is good still.
The money is, I'm not complaining.
All right,
Here, I'm not complaining.
I'm Jill Abramson. I'm teaching at Harvard, a writing course, involved in a digital journalism startup with someone who was my boss early in my career, Stephen Brill, and I was the executive editor of the New York Times until I was fired last spring.
Okay. We hadn't heard that much about that. So let's start with you, Jill, then. Talk about the state of women right now in the corporate world, I guess. It's just across things, in media, in technology. We're obviously in Silicon Valley. I'm just thinking now, because right now, as we're talking, there's a big trial going on in San Francisco. Kleiner Perkins and Ellen Pao have a disagreement about gender discrimination, and it's going to put a lot of focus on that issue here in Silicon Valley. Talk about where you think we are right now. How are you looking at the landscape?
Well, I wish that I could give you a more optimistic evaluation of where we are. I think the Kleiner Perkins trial is just one manifestation here, right where we're talking today, of a world where most of the notes that have been rung about women, at least at the top of tech companies and venture capital funds, is not all that optimistic. I think in a piece in the Times on Monday about the trial, it had a statistic that really leapt out at me that said, I think women had been 10% of the partnership ranks at the major VC funds here in Silicon Valley, which, you know, maybe 5 years ago, which is not a fantastic statistic given where we are and what year it is. But actually that number has dropped to 6% now. That's an eye-popping decline. And I don't want to pick on Silicon Valley, because I think if you survey the landscape and you look at the situation either on the boards of the biggest, most important companies across the economic spectrum, or even in the media, which used to be, you know, in newsrooms around America and at the networks, we were just, it seems a nanosecond ago, celebrating that we had Diane Sawyer as one of the anchors of ABC News, and Christiane Amanpour, and me at the New York Times.
Right.
But you look now, and again, it's sort of, it's not necessarily a dramatic drop, but when you go from,
improvements,
at least we have
decline.
some, you know, women really at the top, to suddenly, if you look at, and I realize that the broadcast network news shows are not the institutions that they were like when Uncle Walter Cronkite was there, but now suddenly we went from a world where there was Katie and Christiane and Diane, and it's all guys again, all white guys again, except for now Lester Holt has stepped up. Right. But
so you have
I don't think it's a moment to necessarily celebrate what the highest leadership ranks look like.
So, Roz, you work for Intel. One of the issues, again, these statistics that Jill are talking about is the same in computer science, one of our most fast-forward industries, I think, in this country.
Right.
It's declined from in half the number of women graduating computer science degrees. I'm just pointing to tech because it's where you work, and it's still, there's a pipeline issue, there's all kinds of things. How do you look at the situation right now?
You know, it's interesting. When I started at Intel over 18 years ago, you know, I was this young black woman who wasn't an engineer, wasn't a computer scientist, so I was isolated in many, many ways. And so as I flip forward, I actually see it from an abundance lens now, because I go back to where we were 18 years ago, and I go to where we are. So I don't see it as much in terms of statistics. I see it more in terms of impact. So when I look up at Intel, and our president is a woman, Renee James, when I look up at Intel, and some of our largest P&Ls are being run by women, when I look at our vice presidents, and it's not just, in all honesty, Caucasian women, there are other vice presidents that look like me. That did not exist 18 years ago. And so on one hand, you can get really bogged down in the negativity of the stats. But I also step back and say, but for my daughter, the opportunity she has of where she wanted to graduate and where she wanted to go is so different than for me, so different than for my mother. So whether, and I think this idea that girls aren't doing math and science, if that's the case, then medical schools wouldn't be half women. I think we have a lot of work to do in technology to have what we do be real in ways that are exciting. So I see it both. Sometimes I look at the stats and I get totally depressed, and then I look at the people and I look at the faces and I get very optimistic. But I will say, tech is still a male-dominated industry. It still is. And so when you go into engineering schools, when you go into computer science classes, the majority of professors are men. The majority of the folks that are in those classes are men. So the reality is that our society has to figure out ways to encourage more women, all women, to go into technology fields and to have that be as respected and valued as other professions. And until that happens, it's going to be very hard.
We do talk about that a lot, this idea of it not happening, but then no one seems to, like, I'm always talking to this VC firm just recently, and we'll talk about that, Jessica. You know, they hired, they were saying, oh, we're looking for a woman, and they hired yet another man. And I said, well, what happened? They're like, I don't know, we couldn't find anybody. And you're sort of like, that seems to be this sort of very pleasant bias that goes, it's not even pleasant, they call it unconscious bias, which I use as an excuse to mean you're lazy and stupid and you can't, you know what I mean? Like, it's an excuse. I'm so sorry I'm biased. No, I don't know how it happened. Once again, I've managed to have 10 directors of Twitter who are all white men. How did that happen? Crazy. You're an entrepreneur.
Yes.
You are in the heart of that. Most of the entrepreneurs don't look like you and don't have that tremendous A statement necklace at all. Well, except for Zuckerberg sometimes does wear one. But how do you look at it as an entrepreneur? Because you had to go out, raise money, difficult, easy, what?
Well, I think I actually hear what both of you are saying, and I come down more on the view that if you're an individual trying to build a career, that you should generally ignore your gender and proceed with the assumption that the world is awaiting for your success.
Right.
So while okay,
I'm going to take issue with that, but go ahead.
While there are issues, I don't think that having that in your head every day serves you in any way. Doesn't mean you don't go out and better the advancement of women in the workplace, but I look at it too on a more macro timeline and perspective. Right? We've been around in our modern form for 40,000 years. Women have had equal roles in the workforce in the last 30, 40. I mean, we have won the lottery on the history of time to be here and now. I graduated in Silicon Valley at the birth of the internet in 1994. I mean, how lucky am I? I mean, that doesn't feel like a disadvantage. It feels like I won the lottery. So I go around generally ignoring the fact that people are not quite open-minded or don't expect women in every roles. But when you think about it on a more macro perspective, you're like, we're doing pretty good. And I, too, with 2 daughters, think that their opportunity in the way that they look at the world gets better and better and better every single day. So I really think that for women, I try to focus on the flexibility that can exist in leadership roles inside of a company as a way to make sure that more women are advancing, because that's the one thing that I can do and control in the world to help advance that. But as an entrepreneur, I have personally never felt discriminated against or that it was a barrier. And there probably were biases all around me. I just chose to ignore them and keep going.
But is that, I'm going to take issue with that because I think it's a lot harder for a lot of women to do that. Because it's sort of like, and I love Sheryl Sandberg to death, but not everybody can lean in. Not everybody can have to do that. And I always joke with her, I always lean in and fall over. But you can't, that can't just be the only thing. I mean, I was at an entrepreneur event where a young male entrepreneur suggested that. Just forget about discrimination. And I was like, oh, that's kind of hard since it's there. And so do you, excuse me, how do you ignore that then? How do you put it?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, and I've noticed them in common with women who are leaders in business. Generally, they've had some kind of adversity they've overcome early on in their lives, whether it's been moving from a different country or having parents that are divorced or a death early on in their family. And I was raised mostly by my dad in a very non-traditional way, so I think I just didn't even know to think of typical gender roles. So I was clueless in a way. And I also just have had other things happen to me where, is this really a big deal that this person is calling me baby? Like, who cares? Moving on. I've got my health.
That's a big deal, but okay.
But meaning, yes, it is, and it's wrong, but it's not going to make me go crawl in the corner and be afraid of getting out there the next day and doing it again. I'm not going to let it stop me, because that would be the far worse tragedy. So that's my point, is the way to address it is to persevere through until you're in a position, as I feel I am now, to change it.
Well, I think, that you just said the operative word. I think we have to change it.
Right.
And I'm not sure ignoring it or not having it in your head necessarily is the right spur for change. And, I'm very conscious, like the two of you, of the great strides that women have made in so many fields. My daughter is a surgeon. The work that she does amazes me. But it also troubles me that it's 2016. My daughter went to Harvard. She went to a great medical school. She's a surgeon. She wants to have a family. This society, our society, has not solved childcare. There are certain policy areas that are still undone. And, when I was very happy to see President Obama in his recent speech say childcare is a great undone policy issue that shouldn't be a little side, something that is, oh yeah, we have to think about it sort of a side issue. It's a central issue, but how is this going to get done? Politically, it doesn't seem to me that in Washington we can expect anything too hopeful anytime soon. But I really think, you know, while I'm conscious of all of the progress that has been made, I've been reading a ton lately about the period of the 1920s, right after women got the vote. And I'm worried that, like, our peers from that period would be a little disappointed with where we are right now in terms of issues that are not addressed. And I think that in some ways being less satisfied and a little angrier is where we need to be right now.
What about?
Well, so, you know, for me, look, this is a reality for me personally. You know, I deal with bias every day. I have the burden of being different every day. I was trained that that was going to be my life. The 1920s, for my family as a black woman, was not an area that we would look back and say we should be more like them. So when I look at that, I say, for me, it's not easier, but it's so darn expected, and I'm so programmed that when it happens on certain days, you catch me on the wrong day, and that's a really tough day to deal with what happens every day. So I'm not up here to try and act like it's okay, just muddle through it, but it is the reality of our lives, and it's going to be the reality of our lives for a while until those of us that get to places where we have influence and power change the table. What I say is I think that women, for the most part, what I've seen is really over the last 20 years, we've been focused on getting a seat at the table. And you can argue whether or not we have enough seats. Mm-hmm. There are certain places you look, we have no seats. I don't think that's unconscious bias, I think that's bias. But when you get to the table, it's just bias. I think when you get to the table, the challenge then is for us to change the table, and I think that's where the opportunity is. But that's why we have to drive to critical mass. It's really hard to change the table if you only have one seat. And so, you know, what I try and say is just, you have to expect it, but you can't let it deter you, because whether it is the women of the 20s or, you know, the women in my family of the 60s, the resilience that they had to have to push through things that, thank goodness, we don't have to push through anymore. But what I think I'm hearing you say is, but we need to have that same will and spirit and that same advocacy in order to push through what we're still dealing with.
So let's talk about that. I'm with her with the stay pissed off part. I'm with Jill. It may reverb that reporter.
That's good balance.
It may be
I guess, you know, I just, again, the floor should be yours, but I think, you know, I wish I believed that changing the seats at the table really was enough to get us to where we want to be, because all I know is that when I became executive editor of the Times, one of the things I'm proudest of is that the masthead of the Times became, those are the top editors in the newsroom. We got to half the sky. For the first time in history, half of the masthead were women, and it was diverse in other ways too, which I agree with you is vitally important, especially for businesses like the New York Times that are covering and interpreting the world for other people. We should look like the rest of the world. But I'm just not sure that even that gets us there.
So what does, Jessica, what do you think has to happen? Because I think that we do sort of accept it. And what has to actually, if the one thing, we just have a very short time, if there's one thing you could see changing, what would you see changing?
What I would like to see change is that the conversation about women at work defines success as happiness, and that needs to include flexibility and not just putting down one yardstick of success for all different types of people with all different types of goals. I think that's what continues to have women confused, that they feel like they have to take one for the team and then they get there and they're miserable. And if we don't start talking about changing the very nature of work, I don't think we're going to make significant enough progress.
Roz?
So, I don't know if there is any one thing, but I think when I look at it, I do think that it will take more entrepreneurs who start companies, who become the next big companies. I still do believe that you have to change the table, meaning that you have to have enough critical mass to where when that male dominant psyche comes into play, there's enough people in that room when that decision is getting made that have the power to say, actually no. And until that happens, I don't think we can push through.
Or we have to educate men to also say no, correct?
Well, you have to educate men to say no. That's part of it. But the reality is that who's going to say no the strongest?
Right.
That's just the reality. And we are educating men to say no. There's just a whole lot of them to educate.
Yeah. I forced marched my sons to the Susan B. Anthony Museum until they got it into their heads, but go ahead.
You know, I think one area where, you know, change could happen if everyone focused on it more, and, you know, it interested me, you know, that at the Oscars, Patricia Arquette,
right,
or whatever we think, you know, she came under, you know, some criticism too because of some of her further explication of the issue, that she seemed to be speaking too much from the point of view of a white woman of privilege. But at any rate, up on the stage at the Oscars, she did raise the issue of pay equity. And I thought she was, you know, definitely gutsy to do that, and to, you know, point out that, again, I don't want to seem like I'm the Cassandra voice of this panel, or the one saying,
too late.
The sky, too late, right? The sky's flying. But, you know, in terms of where we are right now with that, women, you know, broadly, white women make 78 cents, I think it is now, for every dollar that a man earns. If you're a black woman, I think it's 64 cents, and if you are a Latina, it's 53 cents. I mean, that
Have you read the latest research, though, that Claudia Golden put out at Harvard? Claudia Golden, the economist at Harvard, who just published a new paper on looking at that wage gap and how much millennials have closed it based on closing the human capital gap, and how much still exists because of the flexibility gap.
I just wonder, you know, again, the Times did a great piece, I thought, yesterday on, you know, the healthcare economy, which is very dominated by women. I don't think the wage gap is being closed in that industry. I think it's dominated by lots of women who could be earning more.
Although I was most impressed with Patricia Arquette using reading glasses. That was
right.
Guts. That was a gutsy.
That was homage to you, Kara.
Thank you very much. And on that note, unfortunately, we don't have any more time. Thank you very much to all the women on the panel.
Thank you.